throw questions open to the floor. I've got a couple of quick observations that panellists are free to respond to or not, and then one question. My first observation was, I guess, to very strongly support Sam's message in relation to national human rights institutions. We're in a very unique position in that we are independent under the United Nations Paris Principles, and we find ourselves frequently in a position where we're seated between community and government. And so one of our critical tools and our most important tools is actually dialogue, being able to dialogue with community very closely to make sure we have a very sound understanding of their particular issues and concerns, and being able to then communicate those issues and concerns to government. Working in race discrimination means that I'm working with people from very diverse backgrounds, often Aboriginal people from remote communities, and trying to communicate messages on their behalf, not for them, on their behalf with the Australian government, which is an ongoing challenge. But dialogue for us is a very critical tool, and I'm going to try and keep myself to my own 5-minute rule. Secondly, I support strongly what the member for Dandenong said in relation to Victoria being a leader. In fact, the Australian Human Rights Commission, when we look for best practice, often look to New Zealand, we look to Canada, and we look to Victoria. Victoria is certainly a leader in this area. There's one area in particular, though, where Victoria is not being held back by other states, and that relates to transport concessions for international students. Now, I don't necessarily expect a response unless you'd like to make some comments, but it's just for noting that we've got some serious issues in relation to international students in Australia that relate to inclusion and safety, and that transport concessions are a critical part of that picture, with transport not necessarily being very accessible. International students are finding themselves in precarious places at precarious times, which of course contributes to limited safety. Not sure if anyone wants to make a response yet. No. And I've finally got one question. Sorry, was there no response?
Oh, I'm happy to respond now. I thought you were going to give the whole lot. In relation to that, look, I'm sympathetic to the transport concessions. I'd like to see, a bit more of the argument about, some of the issues that students confront from an accessibility point of view. Would having a concession, what sort of difference would it make? From an equity point of view, but this is just one of the things that Treasury's won. Treasury's won that argument, and we had a discussion with Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria here last time. Now is a huge industry, but very little money's being poured back into the international education sector to support the needs of students here, and that is a bit of an unfinished business. And it's we have, if we say tourism's a $10 billion industry in Victoria. Well, international education is about a $7 billion industry. Tourism and major events receive about a budget of about $120 million to support that industry and to make sure that Victorians are responsive, tourism businesses are responsive to international visitors and all those things. We don't have a minister for international education, neither at the national level nor in Victoria. We don't have a parliamentary secretary technically responsible, and probably the budget is only about $1 million to service the sector. So I think that there are some genuine arguments to argue around at least a minister and some more resources to support it, and then prioritising where's the best place to put the resources. Is it concessions, or is it in other areas to support the sector?
I think I'd mention just two things in response to it. I'm not sure that Treasury won that argument convincingly, because there's not enough data to win that argument convincingly. Second, what we do know for sure, because we are in contact at the grassroots with international students all over the country very consistently, and they all identify this issue consistently as being critical to their safety. Secondly, international students pay taxes and therefore deserve the same concessions that other domestic students have access to. I'm going to move on and keep myself to my 5-minute rule. Finally, a question for Professor Mansouri in relation to your comments around hyperdiversity and complex identities. It seems that policy is a complex tool to try and support this, and I'm wondering at a policy level if there are any countries that are actually acknowledging and supporting hyperdiversity positively in doing that well, or is policy just too clumsy a tool for us to be doing that at this stage?
I think the point to understand about the notion of hyperdiversity is its implication for citizenship rights. The point is we no longer hold the old traditional notion of dual attachment, for instance. You know, I happen to be of a certain background, I'm living here. If my attachment to my homeland is stronger, is perceived to be stronger than my attachment to my new host environment, therefore I may well be labelled perhaps someone who exhibits a weakened sense of attachment to where I live right now. I think we need to understand that that's actually quite a very, very awkward explanation, and it doesn't, I think in my view, advance understanding of what it means to live in a truly multicultural city like Melbourne, whereby it's exhibiting that hyperdiversity ought to be also viewed from policy perspectives. And I think the discussion we were having earlier is a very good case in point. International students. Well, it's actually, for me, it's quite challenging to understand or to accept the fact that because they bring such big dollars to the economy here, therefore we ought to be doing something about them. I think we ought to be doing something about them because they first and foremost are human beings. They exhibit certain needs, and as people who live in this environment, they ought to be accorded those services. It's not because they contribute $10 billion to the economy, it's simply because we have a right, they have a right to expect that kind of a treatment based on a very universal notion of ethics in the society where we live. And ethics ought to be, in my view, and morality ought to be, in my view, shaping everything we do. There's another thing I would like to make, a very brief comment about cultural diversity and the challenge it presents to all of us, whether it's hyperdiversity or cultural diversity as such. I think it presents a challenge to the liberal state, if you like. And the challenge is we always have had a huge emphasis on the notion of individual authenticity. That is, individuals are basically have freedoms to express who they are and to affiliate and to align with whatever cultural forms they would like to be. Cultural diversity have for a long time been misunderstood as simply the imposition of collective rights. I think we need to understand it's not really as simple as that. It's not about collective rights as such. It's about understanding that as individuals who live in liberal, secular societies, and that word secular is very problematic too, is that we can have both. We can choose to be members of collective identities like our indigenous brothers, but we could also, within those communities, strive for some individual authenticity, and we need to be giving space for both.
Okay, I think we might move on to questions from the floor. Yes.
Could you expand on your thought that the word secular concept is problematic, and specifically with reference to the comment made in England, post-visit, singling this out as a problem in Britain?
I think if I understood you correctly, why the word secular is problematic?
Yeah, I want you to expand on that.
Why it's problematic?
You said it.
Yeah. No, I said it's problematic because I actually believe that we are witnessing right now what is being termed as the revivalism of religiosity in these societies. That people are now, they've come back strongly to assert their religious identities, and that it's no longer accepted as a given that these societies, these Western democracies, can be described solely in terms of being secular. That is, there's a strict separation of church and state. And if you look at what's happening in many societies, you find that people are coming back to the public sphere. I remember that secularism, basically, its definition, classical definition, is that you more or less keep it in the private sphere. Therefore, you can be religious in your church, synagogue, mosque, home, whatever, as long as you don't come out and contest public ideas in the public sphere. I think that idea now is being challenged because we are seeing many ideologies which explicitly and assertively and confidently come to the public sphere and say, we are going to fight for our religious identity, for our religious rights, and we would like to take a part in whatever is shaping our society. So it's a neo-revivalism of religion, which is now, we're seeing it very much whether it's to do with Muslim organizations in the West, or whether with certain Protestant movements in North America, or whether with certain other types of religions in Southeast Asia. So that is really why I'm saying it's problematic to just use the word secular society, because it's no longer taken for granted that we can very much assign religiosity to the private sphere.
Can I just add to that, and that is the challenge to to all of us in this room and to many of our organisations that we come from. The challenge to us is, in terms of cultural diversity, if we invest in it, is that our first challenge is whether we are able to, and I use a Samoan term called, is to create levar. Levar means space. And what it is that to create the space where there is safety, there's some integrity and some respect being given of each other. And so you can continue these conversations. One of the, and you'll see there's a project that we've done with New Zealand Diversity Action Program, has been the development of a national religious diversity statement. Basically, it just sort of says to those to people who are engaged in this dialogue, is actually to say there are others involved in this space. There are those that have no beliefs. There are those that have quite extreme beliefs, but you have to create a space where this conversation can occur. So, you know, maybe an opportunity for people here in this country and others to might want to start commenting on some of those things.
I know that you have another question, but you may have to corner the panellists after the session during lunch because I can't. Any other? Yes.
I want to know why some of the international students coming in and they've made it. I've been working with international students for 4 years, mainly from India and Sri Lanka. And I think they've been some of the most wonderful people that I've worked with, and I've really enjoyed my work with them. And now they tell me that they're not allowed into the country, or they're having problems with immigration, or they've got to go through IELTS, and the score gets higher and higher and higher, and they're having problems. And I just find it really incredible.
I'm not sure who you'd like to respond. I mean, I can respond to that question, or a panellist might like to respond.
You can respond. Yeah. I'm only a state politician.
I'll do it quickly. Essentially, there wasn't ever any proper planning in relation to infrastructure when we first allowed international students into the country. And you know, I think we believe that, and it's evidenced by, in fact, two of the world's leading experts on higher education who are based in Melbourne, Chris Nyland and Simon Marginson, that lack of planning has then led to a situation where there hasn't been proper infrastructure support. The federal government is now pulling back and making it much more difficult for students to actually come to Australia, but also they've changed rules in relation to permanent residency, which obviously discourages students. There's also a divergence.
The point I want to raise is that we had a great system of RTOs and we had a great system of bringing international students in. Now we're saying we don't want you.
No, we're not. I don't believe that's the government's message. I don't speak on behalf of the Australian federal government, but my understanding is that they are actually trying to limit the flow so that they can consider how to better support the numbers that we have here.
I mean, if I can reply to some of it, I mean, the reality is that, yes, we unfortunately, when international students were growing, we just saw them as sort of, you know, an export dollar earner. And therefore you don't put any resources back into supporting the sector. Some of us that were very strongly supportive of Victoria being an attractive international student destination were arguing with education providers that were mostly then in the public sector, and then there was that massive growth in the private sector where, you know, they didn't even have peak organisational structures to sort of self-regulate, and to be blunt about it, we saw a lot of shonks in a bit. You know, some of them have become, in effect, de facto migration programs, and I think that some of those that have become migrants as a result of fantastic people that will contribute to Australia. But the point is that what they've done is that they've harmed, you know, the international, the education, the quality, perceptions of the quality of education. That then I think government then has overreacted to pull it back. And
Sorry,
that's the unfortunate thing about it. But generally, it was accepted that with our need for more skilled Australians, that the international student stream could be a vehicle for assisting the migration stream if people were qualified in certain areas. The range of categories were actually quite broad. So people were getting qualified and then, you know, not ending up in jobs, and then questions in some providers being raised about the quality of that education and training. So unfortunately, when all these things get bad, governments have knee-jerk reactions, and you know, in the short term, I don't think we've fixed up the international education problem. There are a whole lot of inequities in the system, that need extra support. And even when we were accepting as part of the migration stream, some of us were arguing that we need to take a bit of a settlement approach, which we do quite well with refugee communities. Under the humanitarian program, there are good resources put in place to help the adjustment that humanitarian refugees make in Australia, and to adapt to a new society, and to encourage them to understand the way of life here and how they can go to work and progress with their families, etc. We don't apply that. We never applied that, even with international students who, coming here as young people on their own from cultures where they're, very dependent on family networks that they don't have over here. That pastoral care by education providers, public and private, was not done, and that's an area that government should have put in place very early on. And I think we've got a lot of these wash-up issues still out there that you might be referring to.
I know that you have more questions, but I'm going to have to encourage you to follow up afterwards. And I'd also point to the fact that Vesa Chow is in the room, the Federation of International Students, and so you may want to corner her at some point as well. And the only other thing I'd say in relation to that is that the Australian Human Rights Commission is currently working on a minimum set of standards for international student safety, which is essentially a duty of care. And sorry, a question here?
Purposefully Guernsey, Northern Territory Indigenous peoples, Centrelink payments, and Peter, you may also, as a representative for Australian human rights.
The Australian government have an opportunity next year to report internationally under the Universal Periodic Review to do with its own practices. I can't comment in terms of from another state party. All I can say is that from our experience, the importance of the importance of sustained dialogue, the importance of the thing that we have in the New Zealand framework is that we have three things. One is the Human Rights Act. Secondly is the Treaty of Waitangi. And thirdly is some goodwill. And I think that that a combination of all of those things, that if we want to move ahead in terms of building harmonious relations, it is about creating that really safe space to talk. And I think that if the Australian government is actually creating that, well and good. But I can't comment, on or give value to this government's decisions.
I'll comment briefly because I'm actually taking time away from the experts. But the position of the Australian Human Rights Commission has been, and this was reinforced by comments made recently when the Australian government reported to the CERD committee, so the UN committee that deals with racial discrimination, that the intervention was not a special measure. So the government's now in the process of reinstating the Racial Discrimination Act. We encourage them to do that fully, but in full and proper dialogue with Indigenous communities as set out under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Dialogue is absolutely critical in this process, but before the dialogue happens, as Sam's just mentioned, we need to work on building trust. The intervention has caused enormous harms to some communities that have been affected. It's brought some benefits to other communities, but has caused enormous harm and distrust. And again, Indigenous Australians have seen their human rights protections suspended, strangely enough, to try and recognise or realise some of their other rights. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Other questions? Oh, sorry, I think we have one here.
Interact with fundamentalists or extremists who use their freedom to push forward their agendas. For example, in Indonesia, there's the party called Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Yes.
And due to their right to articulate themselves, they are articulating a discourse that eventually might undermine the democratic and liberal values of Indonesia.
It's a very important question. you know that in terms of Hizb ut-Tahrir, in this regard, I have objection with regard to their, mission to diminish the idea of democracy. I respect to Hizb ut-Tahrir. That's because, that's the way they are. And then, of course, in this regard, so far, Hizb ut-Tahrir does not justify the use of violence. That I respect. On the other side, there are certain, radical conservative groups such as Islamic Defender France, then Majlis Mujahideen, and then Hamas, etc. This is quite problematic. Why? Because they justify the use of violence. And in this regard, the government, usually, especially the current government, this is my critical point to my government, is because they tend to, what we call as letting the situation take place with regard to, not to, say, make such a certain policy which, protect the idea of justified use of violence. So recently there is an attack to the church community, and the government is unable to control. This is very, very dangerous for the future of Indonesia. However, my organization is that, we create a dialogue. What we spread to the pesantren community and to the ordinary people is that, for instance, if you disagree with someone, look, you have to have this kind of perspective. I disagree with you, and I hate you. That's very bad. And we change this kind of statement by, I disagree with you, but I love you. This is very, very important in promoting dialogue. So far we have dialogue, but it's very, very important with Hizb ut-Tahrir. I know Hizb ut-Tahrir very well because the president of Hizb ut-Tahrir is my friend. And of course, we used to discuss seriously about democracy and caliphate. They are committed to establishing caliphate and, of course, Islamic State. I totally disagree with the idea of Islamic State, and of course, I respect democracy, but we have a good dialogue so far. The problem is that the government so far, that our state ideology is committed to Pancasila, 5 principles. Indonesia is a predominant Muslim country, but it is not an Islamic state. But those groups tend to impose strict legal and exclusive Sharia. I disagree with that.
But like you actually gave the example of Hamas, which is a good one.
Yep, yeah.
In that these liberal and democratic values
Yes.
were utilized
Yes.
to bring into power.
Disagree with you, but I love you. That's the most important thing. So because we have to commit, I think you have already understood in the Quranic verse, it's quite clear that we have to develop silaturahim, brotherhood, and in this regard, we have to develop, I just quote in the Quran, bil hikmah, with wisdom, wal ma'izatil hasanah, meaning by doing a good deeds, and then the most important thing is that by mujadalah billati hasan, developing a good discourse. This is very, very important to promote this kind of idea. Thank you.
I can assure you in my next meeting with Australian government officials, I'll be thinking, I disagree with you, but I love you. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, the Australian government's social inclusion agenda talks a lot about a lot of things, but doesn't talk a lot about refugees and migrants. And I work at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, and of late we've been discussing and debating whether we talk about cultural inclusion or multiculturalism. What are the catch cry words we use for promoting cultural inclusion and the inclusion rather than the exclusion of refugees and migrants in our community?
Active participation might be helpful. There are a whole lot of different things, but I think the language that we use have got to resonate with the people we work with and those that we wish to stand with. And hence one of the reasons why I always use don't always use them, but I use the words of these young people from the Citizenship Foundation in the UK, to turn up is a really simple term, because it gets people to motivate them to move. And I guess that whatever we do and whatever language we use, that it's about respect and integrity of the people that we're working and living with.
I think it's a very good question. It shows sometimes that we have to be mindful of the fact that language and discourse changes a lot. You would, if you go to the UK right now, you find that there's a huge social cohesion agenda. We have a social inclusion agenda. In the 70s, there was a huge multiculturalism agenda, which really saw us through the 80s. And so the language and the discourse of social policy changes all the time, and we have to be very mindful of that. What we need to understand is not so much the discursive construction of social policies, but what they mean in practice for those communities and those individuals for whom those policies have been constructed. And if I go to your question, which is refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in general, forced migrants in particular, I think the key issue there is, and I here must say that Victoria has led the way to, is if you have, for instance, a human rights framework within which you can work, a human rights framework, then irrespective of how you call the policy, irrespective of how you design it and sell it to the public, if you are able to measure the effectiveness of your policy in terms of human rights outcomes for refugees and asylum seekers, then I think you'll go a long way towards achieving equitable outcome for all concerned. And I think really that's, for me, far stronger and more important than perhaps to get stuck on what do we call it, cohesion or inclusion. Now, of course, I understand the ideological framing for these policies, and we can debate it, but I think we have to be very mindful of that.
Yeah.
But if I can also add, and in some of the frameworks we put in place, we put our human rights charter after we were doing a whole lot of stuff beforehand, because Victorians generally believe in this stuff. But in answering even some of the questions in relation to the Northern Territory intervention, I mean, we do need to have that debate about an equivalent at the national level, because it's another test, and we have to do that in Victoria. Every piece of legislation has to pass through a parliamentary committee and has to get ticked off as it meets the objectives, and if not, then the government's got to go and explain why a piece of legislation or a particular clause doesn't. But in relation to social inclusion, it came up at the Ethnic Communities Conference as well, and when I was Minister for Gaming and we were trying to use the gambling fund for being dedicated in being more inclusive and focusing at disadvantaged groups, etc., the word social inclusion came on, and we battled to get cultural diversity recognised in there. Right? Now, I think in many regards the social inclusion agenda federally, its origins are a bit different, but I think politically they're grouping everything together, because if you don't want to use the M word and you still want to do stuff, what do you put it in? To me, the M multiculturalism word is more than symbolism. Taking that away, in effect, erodes a lot of the good work that individuals are doing. And if you take an M, if someone's no longer a multicultural officer, what are they? An access and equity officer? So does that mean suddenly they're doing, responsible for the jobs of 2, 3, 4, 5 other people? Their work's getting diluted. So that's the danger with just using social inclusion on its own. But then when you further restrict it, I'd like to finish off probably on the point that Sam Afra again raised. And if we look at the representation of the federal parliament, Victorian parliament is quite culturally diverse. Maybe that's a reason we have some pretty strong policies. That some of us, the reality is when we've had battles, and when I was a minister and I needed support, I basically got the multicultural network and supporters together to put a bit of pressure in the scenes to get a good outcome that I thought was important in policy. If we look at the federal parliament, multicultural Victoria, we have 27 House of Reps MPs and 12 senators. Right? No senators are born overseas. No senators have at least one parent born overseas. 50% of our population in Victoria has at least one parent born overseas. In the 27 members of the House of Reps, we have 2 members of Parliament, both of Greek background, one from the Libs, one from Labor, who at least their parents are born overseas, and 2 members of Parliament that's closely associated with the Jewish community. That's it, and this is multicultural Victoria. Maybe that's why we drop the M words nationally, that even if our representatives, political representatives from Australia, and we'll have Di Natale now come in from the Greens in the Senate, add to that flavour. But generally, if 50% of our population in Australia is at least one parent born overseas, we do not have multicultural representation. We argue quite a bit about, and rightly so, about women on boards, we really haven't got into an argument and discussion about culturally diverse people on boards. You know, it's a glass ceiling that we have to break on our own. You know, whilst we've been improving in women on boards, if you look at multicultural women on boards, we're big F failure. Why shouldn't our parliaments at the national level be more representative? If they are, from my point of view, I think we're going to get better outcomes all round.
Strongly support those comments and would add that we haven't had a federal multicultural policy in Australia since 1996, and so I think there's been an issue with that expertise being lost across the Commonwealth Government in relation to public servants, and we're still trying very hard to work with the Australian Government to give genuine meaning to the social inclusion agenda, both for ethnic communities but also for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I'm sorry if I'm missing some people, but I think you were next.
Professor Mansouri, the new revised Education Department policy on multiculturalism talks not only about valuing cultural diversity, but talks about education towards global citizenship. I would like you to expand on your very passing observation about the shortfalls in the education system, about building capacity for inclusion.
Can I ask that you respond in 2 minutes?
Timely. I think it's a very good question, and it goes to the heart of what I was saying earlier, and I did mention in passing because of the time constraint. I think a lot of us who have had some association with schools education looked at curriculum, looked at practice in schools, looked at some of the problems that were actually emanating from certain schools, specifically northern and western suburbs. We've come to realize that multicultural Victoria, and Australia for that matter, really wants to get its act together in terms of producing lasting, sustainable, long-term positive change. It needs to start with education. The educators who are educating our kids, and let me tell you this, I've got some frightening research findings. Some of them are what we call total racist. The language that's used in certain, and I don't think they're doing it sometimes because they want to be like that. They're doing it because of the lack of pre-service training when they go and get their training degrees to go and teach and practice. And a lot of them indicated that they would like to do some in-service training, professional development and what have you. And therefore, we go back to the multicultural education platform that's been introduced and the emphasis on global citizenship. I think that's actually not a bad idea in many ways. We're discussing why social inclusion has its ups and downs, why there's pros and cons for emphasizing social inclusion. Let me tell you that in terms of international literature on social inclusion, the key problem with social inclusion, it's perceived to be very passive. That it's enough to be included. If you consider me included, then that's good. I can tick the box, I've made it. The emphasis now is more on active participation in societies. So we want the active citizenship, the global citizenship model, to come in and say, look, being merely included is not good enough. I'm sorry. Being merely recognized is not good enough. You need to negotiate with me. Does the curriculum reflect who I am? No. Does the RE reflect where I come from in terms of religious speaking? No, it doesn't. Therefore, we have a big problem. And that problem will, have I reached my 2 minutes? Yeah. So that problem can only be resolved in the long term if we go back to that very fundamental of all institutions, education is, and then we start building from there. Therefore, we are really laying a strong foundation for our society for the future. Otherwise, we will be here 10 years down the track for another conference. We'll be talking exactly about the same issues.
Okay, yes.
My question's for Sam. Sorry, Sam, as a fellow Kiwi, I have to ask him a question. This is really just as a member of the Diversity Action Program in New Zealand. There are some great stories, and I've attended many, many conferences and spoken in many countries about some of the great things that can happen. In a move, I suppose, for it not to become a array of talk fests, are there some ways that we can share our positive stories and our positive behaviours, trans-Tasman, so that we can encourage both, some unification, some support, the positive stories and positive case studies that both go on under the Diversity Action Program through the Human Rights Commission. Is there a way to bring those things together so that there is a greater level of support trans-Tasman?
2 minutes, Sam.
Victoria Human Rights Commission is a very good partner of the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and they've been actively involved in trying to look at ways of being involved with the Diversity Action Program. Can I just say this? It is about action. So you can only be part of the program. It's free to join as an organisation. But after 12 months, you've got to report back about what you've done. If you haven't, you're gone. The thing about it is that it's actually about success focused, and what we've tried to do in terms of our work with the Australian Human Rights Commission and also with the other state human rights commissions is to say, don't copy us. Understand your own environment, create your own space, create solutions that are important to you, because we don't have a lot of the issues that are focused on things. I can totally sympathise with the stuff around international students because we share a common interest. We've been quite involved with the work with the Australians here in that particular area. But in terms of one of the things that we've found with a lot of our activities is it's actually gone global. One of the projects is language, in promoting Indigenous languages and also community languages. On Facebook, we've been doing quite a lot of work with the Vice President of Facebook and his colleagues, is that how do you actually start to engage individuals into this particular, in this activity? And there's one Victorian I'd really want to give big ups for, and that's Mia Northrop, who's a very good example of someone who had a dream. She created Vindaloo Against Violence, and she got it off the ground. And what she did was she thought she was only going to do it in Melbourne. Well, actually, it infected internationally. That idea infected internationally. So the forum that we had this year, we had Mia as one of our guest speakers. All I can say is that from one year to the next, with the activities that we do replicate the kind of things that we want to, we would encourage the state and federal organisations to engage in. We're open for that.
Okay, sorry, I'll come back to you. Okay, yes, and then yes. Yes.
Thank you. I guess it was more of a comment and hopefully a bit of a good news story in response to my friend's recent comment on why don't we use the M word anymore. And I thought it was important just to clarify a few points. Although we don't really use it, I'm Bronwyn Hinds, I'm from the University of Melbourne, and I've just finished writing a book actually talking about how multiculturalism was shaped from below by grassroots organisations such as the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria. And although the M word isn't really used on the front page of government programs or even the front page of government website, it is still there if you probe below the surface. So it's there in speeches, it's there in meetings with government officials, it's there if you click one or two links away from the main page, still on government websites. It's now talked about in a policy framework for recognising and responding to cultural diversity, which is what multiculturalism always was. I see it more as shifting the language, as you referred to. I think multiculturalism developed a bit of a pejorative aspect under the Howard government, and they wanted to move beyond those pejorative aspects by talking about the same issues but without that pejorative term. And I think there's a little bit of good news. Even the Howard government, even though he couldn't bring himself to say the M word for several years, he actually brought in the new agenda for an Australian multiculturalism in 1999. And even him, away from the cameras, would talk about its value. And more recently, I think the fact that we have an Australian, the Prime Minister is from Victoria, Julia Gillard, the head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet is also a Victorian. He used to be head of the Premier and Cabinet here in Victoria. we have Peter Van Vliet, who is the Executive Director of the ECCB, and then Executive Director of FECA, and he's now a Deputy Secretary in the Australian Immigration Department. So I think there are, below the surface, is actually a lot happening. It's just that good news stories don't really make the front pages of the paper as often. And I think while there's an enormous amount of work to be done, I think much more needs to be, I think we should embrace or re-embrace multiculturalism. I don't think it's always as bad as first glance might indicate.
And other panellists may want to respond. I'm sorry, you'd have to gag me to get me not to say this. Multiculturalism didn't feature in the portfolio titles for the federal government, and frankly it's not good enough that it's under the surface.
Yeah. And I'd agree with that. I don't know, maybe for me it's a bit personal, but if you don't want to use the M word, that insults me personally. You know, that I know Julia well, I know Terry Moran well, know Peter Van Vliet well, and I also know, excluding Peter, some of the battles we've had with some of the same people. So, you know, the reality is the M word's been dropped as a political convenience because our political culture, doesn't matter which side of politics, emanates from Sydney. Sydney, and I spoke about this a bit at the Communities Council conference, you know, Sydney runs Australia's political culture. Melbourne does not matter because there aren't many marginal seats. And so your political elite, whoever gets in, that's their, you know, that's their paradigm, and they believe that, you know, when you look at the polls, of course, people in New South Wales are not as strong on multiculturalism, but if your political leaders aren't, why should you be as a people? Because sometimes you do need to lead rather than just focus on 5 marginal seats in Western Sydney, as if, you know, that decides the whole policy of the country. But unfortunately, that's what our politics very much becomes much of. That's what the federal election campaign and Send the Boats Back was really all about. It's about Western Sydney and that political culture. My appeal to around multicultural agenda is we've got to take some of this Sydney stuff head on and say that if you've got issues about diversity in Sydney, don't blame multiculturalism for it. Blame your lack of leadership and resourcing and supporting of those communities where basically, you know, if you're a Sydney community, you know, you've got to go underground or call yourself, you know, we're into community relations, not into multiculturalism. I mean, you know, excuse me, I honestly don't accept. To me, it's a watering down of what many of us have been fighting for many years, and it's the start of a process. I know there'll be many people inside, in the tent, as there were in the Howard government, trying to achieve under whatever name, whatever they could. But if you don't show leadership on these things, then what we sometimes need is leadership to get across the line. We saw that with Jeff Kennett, with Pauline Hanson, One Nation. If Kennett wasn't standing up, I don't think we would have had necessarily the pushback against One Nation if he didn't take a political leadership stand.
I agree with you, and I love you, but we have some comments from the other two panellists.
Yeah.
I think we've got
Can
some.
I just briefly say, I agree with you. I think we tend to forget, and a lot of us who do international comparative research on management of cultural diversity, on intercultural relations in general, I can tell you that one of my current projects right now is looking into that very issue in North America and Europe in comparison to Australia. And a lot of the findings that are coming out from the citizenry, if you like, in addition to from local governance and schools, etc., is showing us that Australia, as a matter of fact, is actually not very bad in comparison. And that a lot of the outcomes of that comparative analysis of the research shows that we very much been hailed as a successful model. Having said all of that, we should not, by the same token, take for granted some of the early successes that we had as a multicultural society. We are facing now some significant challenges. There has been a period of time since the late 90s where the word multiculturalism and cultural diversity have been, unfortunately I should say, have been very much coined in conjunction with other words like risk and insecurity and tension and problems of terrorism, etc. Therefore, since that late 90s, we have seen a re-emergence, unfortunately, of a new discourse whereby we're questioning our very commitment to multiculturalism. Therefore, what I'm saying, I agree with you, comparatively we are doing very well, but by no means we should therefore sit back and take it for granted.
Bernard, I think, did you have a comment? No? Okay. And I haven't forgotten, yes, it's finally your time has arrived. You've had your hand up for a long time.
I'm Judy Moran. We're here because one of the projects that we run through our office is an AusAid-supported project called the Global Education Project. And I can tell you that there is a curriculum document, a federal curriculum document through AusAid that is called the Global Education Framework, that we represent the Victorian branch of that. We actually do professional development with in-service teachers at universities, thousands of them every year. We also see thousands, well not quite as many, but certainly in the around 1,200, 1,300 teachers in schools, and we do professional learning with those teachers about global education. And global education, within that, amongst other things, we teach them how to embed things like cultural diversity, about human rights and social justice, and about global interdependence. There are documents out there. We're relatively well supported, but I guess the issue about curriculum is that, as we can see through the Australian curriculum, what's happening now, unless it's embedded at that level, we get into schools because we work really hard at saying to teachers, we've got this document, we've got this support network, we can help you embed this within your curriculum. But until it's actually supported at that federal, and this is what you're saying about the whole multicultural thing, and I guess my question is, how is it that we can put pressure to bear at that level, and ACARA sits in Sydney also, how do we put pressure to bear on those people to say that global education and citizenship education is really important in schools, and we need to embed it in the curriculum so that it can be taught at that level? Because the sorts of things you talked about before about kids in the playground, kids learn about these issues and become this way because they are learning from adults. If they're taught in the classroom to be accepting of all cultures, then we have a strong way of actually changing our society, as we all know.
Can I just quickly answer that? Global Education Project in New Zealand is an active member of the New Zealand Diversity Action Program, and they were in a similar situation. I think the answer is that collaboration is absolutely important, and the importance of working with other like organisations. We found that Global Education Project and UNESCO were just great partners in working alongside the other associated schools projects, the Building Human Rights Communities in Schools projects, were just collaborated and just started to build an information wave and knowledge wave really in terms of getting the message out there. And they've used every mechanism available to them, probably the best being their website under DevZone. And I agree with you. I just think that global education in Australia as well as in New Zealand, I mean, you really have to work together, and being part of a community such as this that's sympathetic to those causes, and the importance of giving substantive information with young people is just critical. And so, that's all I can say.
Just a very brief comment from me, because I think what you are saying makes a lot of sense. The problem with the Global Citizenship Project and the problem that we had previously with the multicultural education agenda, I can summarize in 2 words. One is we never had enabling strategies. It was a very well articulated policy, no enabling strategies. And I'd like the Minister to perhaps reflect on that. And 2, we've never had accountability and resources, proper resource allocation. And that's what a lot of teachers were telling us. It's one thing to articulate a vision for what you'd like your students to be, the attributes you like in your students and your schools, and leadership, etc. And it's another thing not to have the resources, the enabling strategies, the accountability mechanism in place to be able to say, look, we are actually implementing this, and this is how we can check that we're implementing it. And I think that really my experience with a lot of schools that I worked with.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Let me first say that really I'm fascinated by this conversation, and I really would like to express my thanks to the whole panel, because this is really extraordinary conversation, and I wish actually this would be shared in other parts of the world. I don't think there's any other part in the world where a range of panelists coming from different countries can really discuss so openly, multicultural model of society, and I think this is extraordinarily refreshing. My question is, coming from the old Europe, where I think most countries are very, very, very far away of discussing what's, I mean, you are discussing today, and where, I mean, coming even from, I mean, I'm French, and where there's been last year a huge debate about identity. What is the French identity? And I mean, this is very different in a way to what you are discussing, but it's interesting to see the differences. What I would be interested to hear from you is, in a country where 1/3 or even more of the population was not born on the territory, and where there are so many communities from very different cultures, very different values and religion, is there any thoughts to what it will be, let's say, for the next generation to be an Australian? What are the core values? What is it that you will see that in one generation, let's say in 10 or 20 years' time, will be the common values or the core values, if any, and what is it to be an Australian tomorrow?
Look, I still think that, I mean, we've still got a very large migration stream. It's still very high, so I'd imagine, in 10, 20 years' time that a greater share of our population would at least be conscious that they have an ancestry out of this country. One of the things that I find frustrating is people that are only a few generations, 3 generations, and they say we're Australian, and I say, well, I didn't know that, which Aboriginal community you're from, and I didn't realise that, the lack of awareness. But I think in 20 years' time, because of the mass and some of the things that are going on, I think we will have more of a community realising that, that we're at least interconnected through ancestry. And that I hope that that the positive parts of globalisation, even though you said, it's got some of the other, maybe the globality that you spoke about, that we're a bit more conscious of that at the end of the day, Australia's future, as we realise economically, and one of the reasons we've foregone the financial crisis, is that we've got a mixed investment strategy with the rest of the world. We're a large country, landmass, small amount of population, and our future is really being connected with the rest of the world. But we'll also have this sense of, some of the frustration with some communities against multiculturalism are a perception that some communities are getting a fair advantage ahead of others because there's all these myths go out. You get off the boat and suddenly you've got public housing and, someone else has had to wait. You get off the boat and, people honestly believe these things, that the government gives you money in the bank account and I'm struggling to pay my bills, right? There is this sense of fair go, and we really need to fill that gap, I think, if we're going to have successful multiculturalism, on breaking down some of these myths. So we're going to have this fair go, level playing field, but a greater sense that we are dependent on this relationship around the world. Maybe it's wishful thinking for me, but I think it's actually practically achievable.
Can I just briefly reflect on that? I would love it in 20 years' time if we are holding a federal election and the problem of asylum seekers is not deciding it. That is the Australia I would like to see in 20 years' time.
Next election.
And the reason why I say that is because we have come a long way in terms of defining race and race relations. And if we get to the point where people are not scared of a few thousand people or a few hundred people coming, seeking asylum, 90% of them plus are actually genuine refugees, then I think that is the Australia we would all love to have and would be very proud of living in. We are very proud already. And we would have citizens who have worldviews, that is cosmopolitan orientations, that it doesn't matter how you come, where you come from, whether you sought visa or you're seeking visa when you arrive here, and that ultimately the basis upon which you are treated is the extent to which you are committed to a shared common value system that we have here.
I'd like to see that Australia have made significant progress around genuine reconciliation, and that there was significant investment in protecting Aboriginal culture, in particular the languages which are dying rapidly. And in terms of being able to dialogue genuinely with people, it should be an option to dialogue in your own language. And help, close the gap and help, and a myriad of other things. Yes, down the back. Sorry, did other panellists have any other comments?
Yes, I'm not from Australia.
In response
Nothing
to
from you
the
then, Sam.
question or comment down the front about 20 years and what will happen with the way in which the current generations emerge, what I sense you're alluding to is something that is actually a self-organising social phenomenon. Like what is going to happen is going to happen because of the sorts of life decisions and choices and experience of 20 plus million people. And whatever's going to happen is what's going to happen. And people that might be in academia that make pronouncements about the world, or governments that say, we will make decisions, for example, about the economy, as if the self-organising action of 20 million people is somehow controlled by a few people in Canberra. And when you have a person from, like the head of the Federal Reserve Bank in America coming forward and saying, quite frankly, we don't have a clue what's happening. This is all the results of the decisions of millions of people making choices about how they live their lives. So when we talk about dialogue that links back to grassroots and about community, we're talking actually about self-organising phenomena. And if we're going to really listen to what's happening with self-organising phenomena, there's a whole area that we know little about.
That's an excellent point. We try to influence, I guess governments try to influence and predict behaviours, but it's a point well made. I might jump back and take questions from people we haven't had them from yet. Yes.
Can I just get a really quick attempt at it? And that's this. It's something that challenges us every other day in our country. Language defines identity. It also ensures that your whakapapa, or your line, or your people, that heritage you bring with you, is sustained and goes into the future. One of the things that you'll probably find if you ever visit New Zealand is that English is a colonial tool which has changed considerably from old UK English to incorporate other languages, and you will find that it is quite okay to, where people greet each other using kia ora and mana and going to a whono or to a hui, which is a meeting, and they're from from other communities, because they describe succinctly what it is that people want to do. And I just want to hark back about this thing about what you want your identity to be, or how you want to see Australia or any of the countries you might come from in 20 years. There's a term in Māoridom in New Zealand called manaakitanga. If manaakitanga is not part of that paradigm of future planning, manaakitanga means respect. It means giving due care. It means giving integrity to who you are and those that you live with, and and the other communities that you're trying to build, continue to build the society that you're engaged in. And it's a particular, and it could never have been used 20 years ago as a term, but it is quite well used today. And so, you know, what makes us distinctly different as New Zealanders to Australians? Well, it's certainly not the haka, but it certainly is our language.
I think I raised that, you know, from my point of view, in terms of, you know, if there's a multicultural agenda, the biggest policy failure is the lack of language learning. We're very much dependent. I get tired of politician speeches. You know, we come from, you know, 200 countries. We speak 156 languages, 100 faiths. And what they really should say is, if it wasn't for our immigrants and their kids, we wouldn't speak anything but English. You know, the reality is we do need to accept that the English-speaking world is quite poor in teaching other languages. Now, and it's an issue that all of us face. But I think, you know, if we go back to the 20 years time language, the reality is when you look at a whole lot of strategies around economy, one of the biggest gaps, if you look at our, you know, what's our biggest weakness in our trade strategy with Australia, we might be able to produce the best things at the best price, but language and cultural understanding from a trading point of view is seen as our biggest weakness. Tourism, our market's changing. You know, our second biggest market at the moment is China. Within 3 years, it'll be the biggest market for Australia. In 20 years' time, you know, it's going to outswamp any other market. You know, UK has traditionally been our biggest market in New Zealand, outswamp it. We will not be competitive unless we are multilingual in service delivery and tourist attractions and hotels and all these sort of things. These things come up time and time and time again, but the business sector doesn't actually put it on their agenda, because they realise that there's some barriers and difficulties around this area, and the short-termism means they focus on short-term stuff. You know, the dollar now is so high, the manufacturers are sitting there saying, how are we going to survive when we're so dependent on exports, particularly as a state? So they're going to think on all the short-termism stuff. Unless we develop it as part of our broader skills agenda, language is not going to be there and no one's going to take it seriously unless employers end up advocating for it, because when you actually look at the skills agenda, it tends to get driven by the needs of industry. And even though identified in their plans, no one seems to be pulling all the strings together to guide it. And when we have a look at, you know, deficiencies, I mean, we don't get out, when we talk about, the media talk about education, of course they're talking about, you know, lack of numeracy, lack of literacy, and they might then focus, you know, we don't have enough maths qualified teachers. They might maybe sometimes focus we don't have enough science qualified teachers. I mean, we clearly don't have enough language qualified teachers, and it's great to hear what the geography teachers are doing, and I know you battle through there. The reality is a lot more PD resources are required for all sorts of areas in education, but particularly in language. You know, we've got a very culturally diverse teacher workforce, but we don't have enough people qualified to teach a whole lot of languages. So we get shortages in these, and we find a mechanism to get through to say we're delivering loaded primary and secondary school, which compared to best practice in other countries isn't there where it needs to be, despite the immense work done by those that are low qualified teachers and their peak organisations. So for me, this is clearly unfinished business, and I don't really think we can overcome and say we're truly multicultural until we fix this thing up, because otherwise the languages we speak in Australia is really lip service, speaking about some of our community rather than the majority of our community.
We've only got time for one more question, and I know there are audience members, participants that I've actually missed, so I encourage you to corner everyone during lunch. But one last question.
I have a question for Mr. Amon. You mentioned before that dialogue is not enough, and that the outcome has to be action. I guess my question is, if you're trying to foster cooperation and cooperative action, how do you get communities to find that shared vision? How is it that communities can find the shared ground through which to act together, and how is it that they can identify shared values and a shared vision? You know, considering we still maybe aren't even talking to each other.
Yeah. I just give you also a response to what the idea of multiculturalism. As you know, I myself,
And I can recognise that there are so many problems at the moment that need to be addressed, especially what Desmond Cahill asked and now a lot of the students I find are struggling with identity, and a I think this is something that needs to be addressed because they're struggling with not only language but identity. And because they're struggling with identity, they're kind of like losing who they are. And to be included, they need proper guidance. And so I think the education system does need to be a little bit improved.
Any brief responses before we break for lunch?
No, we agree. We all struggle with identity. Nice.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you very much to all members of the panel. Just a few more housekeeping issues, but first of all, thank you also to Amy, who stood up for that entire session and moderated. That's certainly no mean feat. So we'll be moving into lunch break now, but just before you go, we will be having 4 concurrent sessions after the lunch break, starting from 2:30. There will be the first session on integrating migrants will be in this room. Session 2 on shaping perceptions, challenging stereotypes and the role of the media today will be on level 2 in the Portico room. And in education, culture, developing social cohesion, which is the third focus group, that'll be in the Yarra room, also on level 2. And focus 4, intercultural and interfaith development, religion, faith and traditional faith will be in the supper room on level 3. If you didn't get those, they'll be available on the name tag desk just up there. There's also some artwork from the UNESCO observatories prepared by some children, which you can view now in the foyer as you ingest your sandwiches. And also for all of the moderators and panellists who are in the next session, you can meet us at 2 o'clock. So once again, thank you very much to each of these panelists members here. And it was good to see so many of you still had questions, and I'm sure we'll be willing to put forward them now during the lunch break. Thank you.